She's ignorant of how ignorant she is. That wasn't a tabloid headline. That was J.K. Rowling publicly eviscerating Emma Watson, the same girl she once cast as Hermione. What began as a heartfelt podcast interview spiraled into one of the most bitter and personal feuds in pop culture, tearing open old wounds, dragging Daniel Radcliffe into the mess, and putting the legacy of Harry Potter on the line. But behind Rowling's viral rant is a letter, one sentence long, that triggered everything. And what Watson said on stage at the BAFTA may have lit the fuse 2 years ago. This isn't just a disagreement. This is a total collapse of friendship, loyalty, and reputation. It all started with what looked like peace. Emma Watson, in a podcast with Jay Shetty, spoke with surprising tenderness about her former collaborator. She said she could never cancel Rowling, and despite everything, she still treasures the person she once knew. It was the kind of soft diplomacy fans weren't expecting, a possible olive branch in a years-long controversy. But just days later, Rowling unleashed a 700-word tirade on X, slamming Watson in the most personal terms yet. She dismissed Watson's affection as a change of tack and called her a symbol of privileged hypocrisy. For Rowling, it wasn't forgiveness, it was war. The seeds of this feud were planted back in 2020. That's when Rowling first made headlines for criticizing gender identity activism. She questioned the erosion of biological sex in law and language, and what she said sparked global outrage. Her essay about safeguarding women's spaces was labeled transphobic by activists. Stars from her own franchise, Emma Watson, Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint, began distancing themselves. Watson posted, "Trans people are who they say they are and deserve to live their lives without being constantly questioned." The break was public. But behind the scenes, Rowling was taking notes and names. Fast forward to March 2022, the BAFTA Awards. Host Rebel Wilson introduced Emma Watson with a cheeky jab. She's proud to call herself a feminist, but we all know she's a witch. When Emma took the mic, she smiled and said, "I'm here for all the witches." The crowd cheered, but Rowling didn't. That moment, she later wrote, was a turning point in how she saw Emma. Fans speculated that Watson mouthed "bar one," implying that Rowling was the only witch she wasn't there for. While the line remains debated, Rowling claims what came next cut deeper. Emma sent a handwritten note, just one line. "I'm so sorry for what you're going through." But to Rowling, that sentence was a slap. J.K. Rowling didn't just respond. She detonated. In a nearly 700-word post on X, Rowling unleashed her most personal and direct takedown of Emma Watson to date. And this wasn't vague or polite. This was a scorched earth statement aimed squarely at the girl she once treated like a daughter. Rowling began by making one thing clear. Emma Watson is, in her words, ignorant of how ignorant she is. She mocked Watson's sheltered celebrity lifestyle, comparing it to her own background of poverty and struggle. "I wasn't a multimillionaire at 14, Rowling wrote. "I lived in poverty while writing the book that made Emma famous." That contrast wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Rowling framed herself as someone who fought through real-world hardships, while Watson, she claimed, lived a life uncushioned by wealth and fame, too detached to understand the lives of ordinary women. But then, Rowling took it even further. She described Watson's activism as enthusiastic participation in the trashing of women's rights. To Rowling, this wasn't just disagreement, this was betrayal. She accused Watson of aligning with a movement that, in Rowling's view, threatens single-sex spaces and ignores the lived realities of vulnerable women. And the implication was sharp. Watson, because of her wealth and fame, would never actually need those spaces. Rowling wrote, "She'll never need a homeless shelter. She's never going to be placed on a mixed-sex public hospital ward." She continued, questioning whether Emma had ever had to strip off in a newly mixed-sex changing room at a council-run swimming pool. It wasn't just criticism. It was a reality check. Rowling was painting Watson as someone too privileged to grasp what's at stake for working-class women. The words weren't filtered. They were razor-sharp. She even questioned Watson's sincerity. Rowling alleged that Emma's recent kindness, her podcast comments about love, grace, and treasuring their past, weren't authentic. She called it a change of tack, and speculated that Emma was simply noticing the cultural tides shifting. Full-throated condemnation of Rowling, she implied, wasn't as fashionable anymore. Now Watson wanted to soften the tone, and Rowling wasn't buying it. And just when fans thought Rowling might let go, she dropped one more line. "Adults can't expect to cozy up to an activist movement that regularly calls for a friend's assassination, then assert their right to the former friend's love, as though the friend was, in fact, their mother." That wasn't just a rejection. That was a severance. It wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about loyalty, safety, and what Rowling saw as a public betrayal disguised as progressive virtue. For her, Watson hadn't extended compassion. She'd poured gasoline on an already burning house, and then knocked on the door with a sympathy card. This was no longer just a disagreement. This was personal, permanent, and public. What truly seemed to set Rowling off wasn't the BAFTA comment or the podcast. It was the note. That single sentence, "I'm so sorry for what you're going through." Rowling said this came at a time when she was receiving death, rape, and torture threats daily, when her home was under security lockdown and she feared for her family. For her, Emma's note wasn't empathy, it was damage control. She wrote, "Emma had just poured more petrol on the flames, yet thought a one-line expression of concern would reassure me of her kindness." In Rowling's eyes, Watson used a soft voice to mask a loud betrayal. Watson isn't the only one in Rowling's sights. In her statement, she called out Daniel Radcliffe too, saying he and Emma act like de facto spokespeople for the world she created. Years after they finished acting in Potter, Rowling wrote, they continue to assume they speak for it. She implied that both had exploited their connection to Harry Potter to make political points, while disavowing the woman who made their careers. She added that she had previously refused to comment on Watson specifically, out of concern for her safety. But now, Rowling declared that silence officially over. While Rowling was lighting social media on fire with her 700-word rebuke, Emma Watson took a very different approach, one rooted in restraint, compassion, and an almost heartbreaking sense of hope. In her conversation with Jay Shetty on the On Purpose podcast, Watson didn't go on the attack. She didn't name Rowling directly. Instead, she reflected on their history, the closeness they once shared, the kindness Rowling showed her as a child actress, and the deep personal impact of playing Hermione. She said, "There's just no world in which I could ever cancel her out, or cancel that out, for anything." Her voice trembled slightly. She paused between phrases. It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded raw. But despite that vulnerability, Rowling wasn't moved. Instead of seeing love, she saw strategy, a shift, a play. Watson went on to explain that she still treasures Rowling, or at least the version of her she once knew. "I can love her," Watson said. "I can know she loved me. I can be grateful to her. And there can be this whole other thing. She didn't pretend to reconcile their differences. Instead, she said she's trying to hold two truths at the same time, her belief in trans rights and her gratitude for Rowling's role in her life. But that emotional balancing act, Rowling saw it as hollow. Watson emphasized that she's always open to dialogue, expressing sadness that a real conversation never took place. "I think the thing I'm most upset about is that a conversation was never made possible." And when Shetty asked her directly, "Would you still be open to speaking with Rowling?" she didn't hesitate. "Yeah, and I always will. I believe in that. I believe in that completely." It could have been a moment of healing, a hand extended, but Rowling didn't interpret it that way. She painted Watson's soft words as tactical, not genuine, a change of tack, as she called it. In Rowling's eyes, Watson was pivoting because public sentiment was shifting, because attacking Rowling wasn't as fashionable in 2025 as it was in 2020. And this wasn't a peace offering, it was PR damage control. Even more telling, Rowling didn't just write a rebuttal. She also retweeted a parody video mocking Watson's interview, made by a comedian. Her caption, "I'm here for all the spoofs." That wasn't just cold, that was calculated. A way to minimize Watson's vulnerability by turning it into a punchline. So, who's telling the truth here? Was Watson being sincere, trying to soften the tone, open a door, and acknowledge complexity in a toxic debate? Or was she trying to rewrite her image without taking responsibility for past statements? To Rowling, the podcast wasn't olive branches, it was optics. And to Watson, Rowling's rejection wasn't criticism, it was cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, both of them feel completely justified. The impact of this feud stretches far beyond two women. For millions, Harry Potter was a childhood anchor, a story about courage, loyalty, and magic. But now it's become a political battleground. Fans are torn between supporting transgender rights and honoring the author who created the universe. Can you separate the art from the artist? Can you love Hermione while rejecting Jo? Rowling's comments have become flashpoints for global debate, but so have Watson's. And as their fallout unfolds in real time, the wizarding world itself feels divided. This isn't just a story about hurt feelings. It's a public reckoning between personal loyalty and public advocacy. Rowling feels betrayed by people she mentored. Watson feels silenced by someone she once admired. And in the middle is a fandom watching its heroes pick sides. So here's the real question. Can you still love someone who disagrees with your identity? Comment below. Was Emma being genuine or just saving face? And don't forget, The next video might just uncover what Daniel Radcliffe hasn't said publicly, but may soon regret.